The winter wind howling through the valley was nothing compared to the cold dread settling in Martha's chest as the banker slid the foreclosure notice across the mahogany desk. To the town, Arthur Vance was a pillar of the community. To Martha, he was the man about to steal her family's history. "You have until midnight," Vance whispered, his smile as sharp as a razor. He thought she was helpless, a widow broken by grief and debt. But Vance didn't know about the locked desk drawer. He didn't know about the yellowed paper, or the single, sealed envelope that changed everything. The floorboards of the old homestead didn't just creak, they seemed to groan under the weight of 80 years of unwritten history. For Martha, every knot in the oak was a memory. Her husband, Thomas, had spent his life pouring his sweat into this land, turning a rocky plot of soil into a sanctuary. When the fever took him 3 months ago, it felt as though the very foundation of the house began to crumble. But the physical decay was nothing compared to the financial rot that quickly followed. It started with a single letter from the town's only financial institution, Oak Ridge Mercantile Bank. The letterhead was elegant, but the message was brutal. An outstanding loan, buried deep within the estate's paperwork, had suddenly been called due. The amount was staggering, more than the farm could produce in 5 seasons of perfect harvests. When Martha first walked into the bank, she expected to find a sympathetic ear. Instead, she found Arthur Vance. Vance was a man who wore his prosperity like armor. His suits were imported, his fingers adorned with gold, and his eyes completely devoid of warmth. He treated the townspeople not as neighbors, but as assets to be liquidated. "The market shifts," Mrs. single-handedly dictates these terms, Vance had told her during their initial meeting, his voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made Martha's skin crawl. "We cannot afford to carry non-performing debts, even for someone with your historical attachment to the area. Contrast this with the reality of how the community used to operate. Decades ago, transactions were sealed with a handshake over a fence line. A man's word was his currency, and the bank was a partner in the town's growth, not a predator waiting for a moment of weakness. Now, the modern corporate machinery had arrived in the valley, personified by Vance, and it was swallowing the independent families whole. Martha knew she was being targeted. The farm sat on the most fertile valley floor, right where the new railway expansion was scheduled to pass. Vance didn't want the money, he wanted the deed. He wanted to pave over the orchards, tear down the barns, and sell the right-of-way to the transit conglomerate for a massive windfall. Every night since Thomas passed, Martha sat at the kitchen table, a single kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. She went over the ledgers again and again, her fingers tracing the neat, disciplined handwriting of her late husband. Thomas was a meticulous man. He never missed a payment, never overextended, and mistrusted the modern banking system with a fervor that Martha had once dismissed as old-fashioned paranoia. "Keep your eyes open, Martha," he had warned her shortly before his passing, his voice weak but his gaze intense. "The wolves don't hunt in the woods anymore. They wear tailored coats and carry briefcases." The pressure escalated over the weeks. First came the polite reminders, then the formal demands, and finally, the threat that arrived this morning. A formal decree of foreclosure, stating that if the balance wasn't settled in full by the end of the business day, the sheriff would be dispatched to enforce an eviction notice. Martha had spent the afternoon searching every corner of the house. Looking for anything she might have missed, a hidden savings jar, a mislaid piece of jewelry, any asset that could buy her time. The search yielded nothing but dust and memories. Desperate, she returned to Thomas's private study, a small room at the back of the house that smelled permanently of cedar wood and pipe tobacco. She sat in his heavy leather chair, burying her face in her hands, allowing the tears she had held back for months to finally fall. As she wept, her knee struck the underside of the desk, causing a strange, hollow clicking sound to echo in the quiet room. Martha paused. She wiped her eyes and reached beneath the heavy desktop. Her fingers brushed against a small, recessed wooden latch. With a gentle push, a hidden compartment slid outward from the back of the central drawer. Inside lay a single, heavy parchment envelope, sealed with red wax that had grown brittle with age. There was no writing on the outside, no name, no address, no instructions. She picked it up, feeling the unexpected weight of whatever was contained inside. The wax seal bore an imprint she didn't recognize, an old crest featuring an anvil and a key. Her first instinct was to break the seal right there in the dim light of the study, but a glance at the grandfather clock in the hallway cut her breath short. It was already 4 o'clock. The bank closed its doors to the public at 5, and Vance's final deadline loomed. If she was going to face the wolf, she would have to do it now, even if her only weapon was a mystery wrapped in old paper. She placed the envelope securely inside her heavy wool coat, tied her bonnet, and stepped out into the freezing wind, leaving the empty house behind. The walk to town was a brutal reminder of Martha's isolation. The wind ripped across the open pastures, kicking up flurries of fine, sharp snow that stung her face. Yet, the physical cold was nothing compared to the burning resolve growing in her chest. She kept her hand buried deep inside her coat pocket, her fingers tightly gripping the heavy parchment envelope. The brittle wax seal pressed against her palm, a solid, unyielding shape that felt like a lifeline in a turbulent sea. When she reached the main street of Oakridge, the contrast between the old world and the new was stark. The traditional timber-framed shops, built by the hands of early settlers, were increasingly overshadowed by the imposing brick and granite facade of the Oakridge Mercantile Bank. The building looked like a fortress, designed specifically to make ordinary citizens feel small, insignificant, and powerless against the march of capital. Martha pushed open the heavy brass-trimmed doors. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of expensive floor wax, coal smoke, and ink. The tells looked at her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. Everyone in town knew what Arthur Vance was doing, but no one had the leverage to stop him. In a small community, the man who controls the debt controls the narrative. She didn't stop at the counter. She walked straight toward the frosted glass door at the back of the lobby, which bore the title President in gleaming gold leaf. She didn't knock. She turned the knob and stepped inside. Arthur Vance was sitting behind his massive desk, counting a stack of banknotes with practiced precision. He didn't look up immediately, intentionally making her wait, a classic power play designed to erode whatever confidence a visitor had left. When he finally raised his head, his face wore a mask of polite, patronizing concern. "Ah, Mrs. Hawthorne," Vance said, leaning back in his leather chair and weaving his fingers together. "I must admit, I didn't expect to see you again today. I assumed you would be using these final hours to pack your belongings. The sheriff is very punctual, you see." "I am not packing, Arthur," Martha said, her voice remarkably steady despite the racing of her heart. She stood on the opposite side of the desk, refusing to take the lower chair he usually offered to supplicants. "I am here to discuss the validity of this alleged debt." Vance sighed, a theatrical sound of deep disappointment. "We have been over this, Martha. Your late husband signed the line. The bank extended a line of credit during the bad frost 3 years ago, using the land as collateral. The term has expired, the bank requires liquidation, and the law is entirely on our side. It is a simple matter of arithmetic, not emotion." "Thomas never spoke of this loan," Martha challenged, her eyes locked onto his. "He kept meticulous records. Every seed purchased, every nail driven into the barn was accounted for. Yet, there is absolutely no record of Oakridge Mercantile ever transferring these funds into our accounts." Vance smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. "A man who is failing often hides his failures from his wife, Mrs. Hawthorne. Pride is a powerful thing. Thomas simply chose to spare you the anxiety of his poor financial management. Now, unfortunately, the bill has come due, and you must pay for his pride." The sheer cruelty of the statement hit Martha like a physical blow. For a brief second, doubt crept in. What if Thomas had hidden it? What if he had broken under the pressure of keeping the farm afloat? But she shook the thought away. She remembered the hidden compartment. She remembered the anvil and key seal. "My husband was many things, but he was never a liar, and he was never a fool," Martha said. She slowly reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the heavy envelope, and placed it squarely on the center of the mahogany desk. Right on top of Vance's neat stacks of currency. "But I think you are both." Vance's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes dropped to the envelope. The moment his gaze landed on the brittle red wax seal, his entire posture changed. The casual, arrogant slouch vanished. He sat up completely straight, his face draining of color so fast that he looked like a ghost in a tailored suit. Where did you get that?" Vance asked, his voice suddenly losing its smooth, polished edge. It was raspy, stripped of its artificial authority. "I found it where Thomas left it," Martha replied, noting the sudden tremor in the banker's hands. "In a place reserved for things that are meant to be kept safe from thieves. You recognize the seal, don't you, Arthur?" Vance didn't answer. He stared at the anvil and the key as if it were a venomous snake coiled on his desk. He reached out a hand to touch it, then hesitated, pulling his fingers back as if he feared the paper would burn him. The confident corporate predator had vanished, replaced by a man who looked suddenly trapped in his own cage. "This changes nothing," Vance muttered, though his voice lacked any conviction. He looked up at Martha, his eyes darting toward the frosted glass door to see if any of his employees were watching. "Whatever old family trinket or historical nonsense is inside that envelope cannot cancel a legally binding foreclosure. The clock is ticking, Martha. At midnight, the farm belongs to the bank." "Then you shouldn't mind if I open it right here," Martha said, reaching for the envelope. "Let's see exactly what my husband left behind." Martha did not wait for his permission. With a swift, deliberate movement, she slid her thumb beneath the flap of the heavy envelope and pried it upward. The brittle red wax cracked with a sharp snap that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. Arthur Vance flinched, his eyes widening as Martha drew out a thick stack of folded documents, yellowed at the edges but remarkably preserved. The paper was high-grade bond, the kind used only for the most solemn legal transactions nearly half a century ago. At the very top of the first page, printed in an austere, old-fashioned typeface, were the words, "The Founding Charter of the Oak Ridge Mutual Credit Syndicate." Vance's hand shook as he reached out, trying to snatch the papers from her grasp, but Martha was quicker. She pulled them back, stepping just out of his reach. "Let's look at the history of this town, shall we, Arthur?" Martha said, unfolding the main document. "You always like to talk about the law and arithmetic. Let's see what the founding arithmetic actually says." As her eyes scanned the elegant script, the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed began to fall into place. This wasn't a personal letter or a hidden diary. It was a legal document of paramount importance. The Oak Ridge Mercantile Bank had not always been a corporate monolith owned by distant investors. 45 years ago, it had been founded as a mutual credit syndicate, a cooperative venture designed by the Valley's original homesteaders to protect themselves from predatory outside lenders. The anvil and key seal belonged to the town's original blacksmith, who had served as the syndicate's first treasurer. And listed at the very top of the founding contributors, with the largest single deposit of gold bullion to establish the bank's initial lending capital, was the name Jonathan Hawthorne, Thomas's grandfather. "This is ancient history," Vance hissed, his voice rising in pitch as he tried to regain his composure. He slammed his palms down onto the mahogany desk. "It's irrelevant. The syndicate was restructured 20 years ago when Oak Ridge Mercantile became a joint stock bank. The old charter was nullified by a vote of the board of directors." "Was it?" Martha countered, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that seemed to echo off the high ceilings. "Because according to Article 9 of this original charter, the very article that established the framework for any future restructuring, the founding family's original share cannot be diluted, sold, or transferred without the explicit, written consent of the direct male heir. And if any attempt is made to seize the founding family's homestead via debt foreclosure, the entirety of the bank's outstanding reserve capital must first be audited by an independent state magistrate to verify that the bank itself is not in breach of its fiduciary duty to its founders." Vance's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at the document in her hands as if it were a death warrant. Contrast this with his absolute confidence just 10 minutes prior. He had believed he was dealing with a broke, desperate widow who could be easily intimidated by legal jargon and a sheriff's badge. He had assumed that by burying the old records and rewriting the town's history, he could steal the valley's most valuable land without anyone ever realizing that the Hawthorne family practically owned the ground the bank was built on. Thomas hadn't hidden a shameful loan from Martha. He had hidden the ultimate shield. He had known that the corporate wolves would eventually come for the land, and he had kept this charter safe until the exact moment it was needed to spring a trap of their own making. "Let me see that," Vance whispered, extending a trembling hand. "Let me look at the signatures." "You can look from there," Martha said, holding the document open so he could see the bottom of the page. There, signed in dark, permanent ink, was the signature of Arthur Vance's own father, who had been a junior clerk at the time, witnessing the original transaction. Beside it was a clause stating that the Hawthorne family held a permanent, non-expiring veto over any foreclosure actions initiated by the institution they had helped create. The reality of the situation began to dawn on Vance. If Martha took this document to the state capitol, the upcoming railway expansion deal wouldn't just be delayed, it would be completely dismantled. The transit conglomerate would never do business with a bank whose ownership structure was under a cloud of fraud and litigation. The massive windfall Vance had promised his shadow investors would vanish, and his career would be utterly ruined. "Martha, let's not be hasty," Vance said, his tone shifting completely. The arrogant predator was gone, replaced by a desperate negotiator. He leaned forward, his hands clasped in a pleading gesture. "We are both reasonable people. There is no need to involve the state capitol or tie this up in court for years. I'm sure we can reach an accommodation. What if I waive the outstanding debt entirely? We tear up the foreclosure notice, you keep the farm, and we forget this ever happened." Martha looked at the man who had driven her neighbors to bankruptcy, the man who had laughed at her grief just moments ago. A cold smile touched her lips. "Forget it happened, Arthur?" she asked softly. "I don't think so." The silence in the office was so thick that the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby sounded like a countdown to a demolition. Arthur Vance sat frozen, his eyes darting between the yellow document in Martha's hands and the telephone on his desk. He was a man who had built his entire career on calculating risk, but he had never factored in the survival of a 45-year-old ghost. "You think you've won," Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, desperate hiss as the panic began to sour into malice. "You think this old piece of paper makes you untouchable. But you're just one woman, Martha. If you take this to the state capitol, it will take years to crawl through the courts. Meanwhile, I have the resources, the lawyers, and the political connections to tie you up in litigation until you starve. By the time a judge looks at that charter, you won't even be able to afford the kerosene to light your lamps." Contrast his empty threats with the ironclad reality of the document Martha held. Vance was blustering because he knew that in the court of public opinion, and more importantly, in the eyes of the railway regulators, even the whisper of a fraudulent title would kill the transit expansion instantly. Big Capital didn't invest in uncertainty. "I won't need to go to the Capitol just yet, Arthur," Martha said, her voice dropping to a calm, deadly whisper that cut right through his bravado. "Because I'm not the only one you've used these fake debts against. I spent the last 3 months watching you squeeze the Millers out of their silo. And the narrative you used on the missing ledgers was exactly the same. You told them their father had a secret debt, too." Vance's eyes widened slightly. "That's entirely different. Their paperwork was completely standard. Their paperwork was processed by your bank, under your pen." Martha countered, stepping closer to the desk, her shadow falling over him. "This charter doesn't just protect the Hawthorne homestead. Look at Article 12. It explicitly states that the founding family retains the right to call for an immediate, independent audit of the bank's active asset registry if any predatory practice is suspected. If I sign this declaration right here, the local sheriff is legally obligated to lock these doors tomorrow morning and seize your ledgers until a state investigator arrives." The implication hit Vance like a physical blow. A state audit wouldn't just uncover the truth about the Hawthorne farm, it would reveal the systematic fraud he had perpetrated against dozens of families in the valley over the last decade. The unrecorded loans, the inflated interest rates, the manufactured defaults, all of it would be laid bare under the harsh light of a criminal investigation. He wouldn't just lose his position, he would exchange his tailored wool suits for a prison uniform. "What do you want, Martha?" Vance asked, the final remnants of his arrogance collapsing. He looked older now, the sharp lines of his face sagging under the weight of sudden defeat. "Name your price. The bank can clear your debt, give you a permanent stipend, whatever it takes. Just leave the rest of the town out of this. My price isn't money, Arthur, Martha said, her gaze unyielding. You are going to sit at that typewriter right now, and you are going to draft 3 distinct documents. First, an immediate and unconditional cancellation of the foreclosure on the Hawthorne farm, acknowledging that no debt exists. Second, a formal release of the lien on the Miller family's property. And third, you are going to sign a letter of resignation from this institution, effective at the end of the month. Vance gasped, shaking his head in disbelief. Resignation? This bank is my life's work. I built this modern branch from nothing. You built it on a foundation of theft, Martha corrected coldly. You have 10 minutes to start typing. If that clock strikes 5 and those front doors close before these papers are signed and witnessed by your chief teller, I am walking straight to the magistrate's office with the founding charter. The choice is yours. You can lose your job today, or you can lose your freedom tomorrow. Vance stared at her, looking for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of weakness he could exploit. But he found nothing but the quiet, enduring strength of a woman who had survived the worst life could throw at her and had nothing left to fear. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached over and pulled the heavy iron typewriter toward the center of his desk. The room filled with the sharp, mechanical clacking of the keys, the sound of a tyrant undoing his own empire, one letter at a time. Martha stood over him, her hand still resting on the ancient envelope, ensuring that every word typed matched the exact terms of justice the valley had been denied for far too long. The mechanical clack of the typewriter finally stopped, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the office. Arthur Vance pulled the final sheet of paper from the carriage, the tearing sound sharp and definitive. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely align the pages. He took his fountain pen, dipped the nib into the inkwell, and scrawled his signature across the bottom of all 3 documents. Each stroke of the pen looked jagged, a visual manifestation of his absolute defeat. It's done, Vance whispered, refusing to look her in the eye. He pushed the papers across the mahogany desk. Everything you demanded. The Hawthorne debt is cancelled, the Miller lien is dissolved, and my resignation is signed. Now give me the charter. Martha picked up the fresh documents, carefully reading through every line to ensure there were no hidden clauses or legal traps. Once satisfied, she folded them and placed them into her coat pocket, right next to the ancient, yellowed pages of the founding charter. I never said I would give you the charter, Arthur, Martha said quietly. Vance bolted upright in his chair, his face turning a furious shade of crimson. We had an agreement. You said if I signed, you wouldn't take it to the magistrate. And I won't, Martha replied, her voice remaining perfectly calm. As long as you pack your things and leave this valley by the 1st of the month, the charter will stay in my locked drawer. But the moment you try to reverse these decisions, or the moment you attempt to squeeze another family in this town, this paper goes straight to the state capitol. Consider it a permanent shadow over your legacy. She didn't wait for his response. Martha turned her back on the broken banker, pushed open the frosted glass door, and stepped out into the main lobby. Contrast the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the office she had entered an hour ago with the profound sense of liberation that washed over her now. The bank's grand lobby no longer felt like a fortress designed to intimidate her, it felt like a building whose true ownership had just been restored to the people who built it. As she walked past the tellers, she caught the eye of the chief clerk. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and unspoken gratitude. They had heard the shouting, they had heard the typewriter, and they knew the tyrant had finally encountered a force he couldn't break. Martha stepped out of the heavy brass doors and onto the main street of Oak Ridge. The freezing winter wind was still blowing, carrying a fresh blanket of snow across the valley, but the cold no longer bit at her skin. The heavy dread that had settled in her chest for months was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, radiant warmth. She walked down the street, stopping briefly by the Miller family's dry goods store. She didn't say a word, she simply slipped the signed lien release under their front door. Tomorrow, they would wake up to a miracle, realizing that the roof over their children's heads was safe, and that the modern predator had been forced to let go of his prey. The walk back to the homestead was peaceful. As the sun began to set over the distant mountains, casting long streaks of brilliant gold and deep purple across the white landscape. Martha looked up at her house. The old timber structure, built by Thomas's grandfather and maintained by the sweat of the man she loved, stood strong against the winter storm. It was no longer a place marked for destruction, it was a sanctuary preserved. She entered the quiet house, took off her heavy wool coat, and walked straight back to Thomas's private study. She sat down in the heavy leather chair, the scent of cedar and tobacco wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. She opened the secret compartment beneath the desk and carefully placed the founding charter back into its dark hiding place. Beside it, she laid the official cancellation of her foreclosure. Martha looked at the empty space beside the desk where the kerosene lamp flickered, casting a warm, steady glow across the room. For the first time since her husband's passing, she didn't feel the crushing weight of grief. She felt his presence, a quiet reassurance that their legacy had been protected, and that the land would remain in the hands of those who loved it. The modern corporate machines would continue to march across the country, building railways and changing the face of the old world. But in this specific valley, on this specific farm, the boundary line had been drawn. A single widow, armed with nothing but the truth and a single, forgotten envelope, had stood before the wolf and made him retreat.